Very good. So in a previous life, I had a manager who would, when you joined the organization in a meeting, call you out and say, what kind of stereo do you have at home? Because he wanted to, know who he was dealing with. So in that vein, what do you play?
Yeah, so in another life, a past life, I was definitely a lot more first-person shooter games. So I did a lot of Call of Duty, a lot of Halo, Halo 2, things like that. Yeah. Madden was a big one. They discontinued it, but NCAA football, a lot of those elements. Today is more geared around Fortnite, Rocket League I play personally. So all these games, what I play.
Lucas, what do you play?
You may not be able to tell by my hair color that I'm more of the Pac-Man Tempest Defender generation. My idea of video games is a stand-up machine and a quarter and a joystick. But I actually really don't play many of the current generation of games. I watch a lot of games, and I obviously broadcast them and know a lot about them, but I'm actually not much of a gamer myself.
I still have a Space Invaders cabinet down in the basement of my parents' house in Chicago. All right, so what are some of the examples of the largest esports productions happening in the world? What do you think they're doing to engage audiences in unique and new ways?
You want to take that one first?
I'm just curious, the audience here, how many of you have been to an esports event? Woohoo! Okay, except for him. So how many you guys, for those of you that haven't, how many of you would consider yourself new to esports and are coming here mainly to learn a little bit about the market? Okay, so just to give you an idea, I am not a traditional gamer, right? I came into the world by sort of the sales guy route of I was looking around for my company going, hey, what are the cool markets out there? And somebody said, well, you ought to check out this esports thing. And I was like, it's video games, forget it. And that was before I started diving into it. And if you do research, if you're a scientist, for instance, and you do research, there's something called letting go of your priors, which basically means dropping your preconceptions and what you think you know about a market and gathering new data and basing your information on that new data. Well, I started learning that the AAA game titles made more in an opening day weekend than Avengers does in a month. League of Staples Center sells out in 10 seconds for 3-day events. And when you go to one of these events, they're friggin' madness. I mean, it's nuts. And I was like, oh, this is a market. Okay, fine. So that doesn't answer what are the biggest events. I mean, there's obviously a lot of League of Legends stuff. The Fortnite World Cup was a huge one recently. Counter-Strike Go does a bunch of them. But the main point is it almost doesn't matter to me what the events are. It matters to me that they're consistently selling out stadiums and continuing to sell out stadiums.
Yeah. No, definitely. To add to that, I think that Rocket League did something at Pruitt Center in New Jersey. They sell, those events. All these things are selling out so quickly that it kind of makes you relook at some of the elements. Like coming from a traditional broadcast environment, my background's more in the trenches, in the weeds as an engineer. And so getting to see a traditional broadcast kind of grow into an esports broadcast lets you kind of appreciate a little bit difference of, hey, you can sell out a stadium where people are making millions of dollars, and then going into an environment where you now say, okay, these players are now making millions of dollars in stages that are set up, and these are average Joe 16-year-old kids that now are millionaires. And so when you start kind of reassessing and looking at that going, what other medium, what other environment can someone come in cold turkey? They have all the tools that they need to train, and I use that word train, to perfect a skill and then execute on that skill on a high platform with multiple spectators envying them because they have such a high skill set. Those type of sets is, I don't know, so a little different if perception-wise from a traditional to an esports set.
Quite true. Well, I mean, we talk about largest. How many?
Yeah,
I mean, you were talking about how busy you're going to possibly be this weekend?
Yeah, I mean, so to give kind of an example, we have 2 studios with over 10 sound stages that we're running 4 events this weekend that are over the weekend that are 10-hour broadcasts. And that's something that you're going to find different in esports versus traditional broadcast is you're going to see a lot longer events, and you're going to see a lot longer engagement for the esport event. This is something where people watch a little bit on the side, have it going. If you think more maybe Olympics where it's running all day, we're tuning in, we're checking in, and kind of that setup. But for us personally, we stay pretty booked as far as event after event after event in our sound stages.
Baseball just feels like 10 hours. Oh, no, sorry.
Wow.
That's a little
Yeah,
too early.
we're not
Yeah,
supposed to
we're not
talk.
supposed to
Until
talk about
next
that
year.
baseball right now.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, Soldier Field, I'm
Yeah.
a Bears fan. I'm from Chicago. It's going to be in use 8 times for the primary use this season, which is, that's for the year.
Yeah.
8 times. It's been there since 1916. All right. What do you think? Well, first of all, there's likely a lot of live production people here, if not folks who have been into esports in particular. What do you think the core differences are when you're looking at an esports tournament than a traditional sports?
So there's some key elements that you kind of want to dive into, and just to kind of give some full clarity on everything, I can't. We're a real white label solution, so NGE. I can talk on my personal, what I believe, recommend equipment and stuff, but in any scenarios that I give recommendations, it's not anything like a publisher setup. So just kind of giving the full disclaimer there. But like when you start looking at a traditional broadcast versus an esports broadcast, you look into, hey, there's a 10, 12 camera setup. We're going to load in with a truck. We're going to put these cameras up at the top, center court, over the goal. We're going to have an interview sideline camera, this, done, set up in 4 hours, over. When you start looking at an esports environment, you say, what game is it? How many players are there? Because when you look at NFL and there's 11, you're looking at 5 people on a team for basketball. You start seeing a little, there's not as much changes that happen. With esports, it could be 3v3, it could be 5v5, 7, 8v8, 16, all the way up to 100 players, as now we're seeing with battle royales. And so that element complicates production so much. So when you start looking at shows that has 276 inputs, what infrastructure has that as a technical person, right? You start going and you're saying, now you're pioneering, going, how do I solve this problem, right? Like, how do I get that many feeds? How do I get that many replay channels? These are stuff that you're competing Super Bowl level productions on a daily basis, right? And so how do I jump to that hurdle? How do I jump to the next step? How do I make this efficient so that someone can just do this every weekend and not have millions and millions of dollars to do it, right? And so that's, I think, when you start looking at a traditional broadcast versus an esports broadcast, there's players that are in the building, and then there's a lot of times that players are not in the building. And that's something that is kind of mind-boggling, because most of our delivery methods are internet, twitch.tv, YouTube, Facebook. Most of the consumption of this content is happening online. And so the players are actually playing online and coming back, right? So I think when you start thinking of a traditional sports experience versus an esports experience from a player's perspective, that can vary a lot. And to note one other thing, I would say the spectator's experience is a lot different, right? When you look at a traditional sport, we're going to go for a few hours, we're going to get nachos, we're going to get beer, we're going to cheer for a team, all right, we're going to make it home by this time. It doesn't happen. I could say that esports, we actually go through multiple meals. So you're going to get your first meal, your lunch, you're going to get your dinner, you're going to watch, you're going to hopefully make the finals right before happy hour, kind of like, that's where you're
in a double elim, you think you're almost done, and then, there's another match. Well, we're here for another 3.5 hours.
And that's a great point, because I think another element with esports is the best of 7s, best of 5s. You start to see a lot more of that. So those are kind of the big technical elements, player elements, as well as spectator elements.
Yeah, everything that he said, plus when you're dealing in esports, all of a sudden, in addition to your traditional EIC, how many of you would say that you're in the broadcast world? All right.
Okay, good.
So
you start losing good terms.
In addition to like your EIC, TD, and in addition to stuff like that, when you're dealing with esports, you also have to have an entire IT department. And you're dealing with pings and lags and delays there, and how to solve that. So your IT department needs to be as sharp. Your IT engineering department needs to be as sharp as your video engineering department when you're dealing with esports.
Yep.
Well, and we were talking a little earlier about you see things as a spectator sometimes. You're like, oh yeah, I know how that problem got solved.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the esports world. There's constant innovation, and I mean, NGE does a lot more shows than my company does. But at least every single show that we do, there's probably at least one small element that we look at and we go, okay, how are we going to fix that? Or how are we going to do that? Not because it's a problem, but because it's something that hasn't been done before. It's a kind of problem that hasn't really existed before, and you're like, how do we fix that? And how do we duct tape that together for this show so that we can then figure out how to actually do it for the next show?
Yeah, no, exactly. And that would be something that I would say even when you're dealing with publishers or CDNs that are not traditional, like a NFL or NBA, where there's a tried path, right, that we can go back and look at. You start seeing they're actually a little bit more risky. They're willing to risk a little bit more. When we're pushing to Twitch.tv and they're like, hey, we're going to do a game patch, and we hope that the audio comes through on this feed, but we don't know what's going to happen. And you're like, cool, we're going to be ready for it, and here's 3 ways we're going to fix it, just in case it doesn't work right before we go live. And that's what's kind of really interesting is the growth of technology, the team members that are a part of all that, they look at it and go, hey, we can fix that with a firmware update, a patch. We're going to make this change. Where like, if you go back to a traditional world, it's like, hey, we faxed everything, everything's been touched, don't touch anything before the show tomorrow. Like, that's where we go, right? And so it's kind of a relearning process because everyone's willing to say, hey, let's go ahead and download a new game version. And I'm going, no. We've just went through
No patches.
everything. Like, no, like I have to start over to fax, right? And so you can kind of appreciate that as a technician going through that to say, like, okay, here we are, pushing the boundaries, and clients that with 1 second of black on the NHL network or something like that in traditional realms, it kind of goes unnoticed on, hey, the video player buffered a second. Does that matter? Like those are kind of those questions that are now being posed by the developers.
And the game world is constantly pushing boundaries of technology that broadcasters really haven't even started thinking about. I mean, if you start talking to a CDN, if you start talking to an NBC or a CBS or a network about, hey, how are we going to do 120 hertz and 240 hertz? They're going to be like, duh, I don't know. It's so there's all kinds of realms of technology along every single part of what you would call the traditional broadcast chain that esports is pushing and breaking.
Yeah.
And CDN, for those who don't know, Content Delivery Network. And the business is not good for growing longer fingernails, is it?
No, not at all.
Very cool. What do you think the core infrastructure pieces are, from a personal perspective, that are important to get this from venue to the CDN and out to the audience?
Yeah, so I guess that's really going to probably depend on games and stuff. I'll kind of pinned into where esports looks at versus our traditional stuff. Like if we're looking at, you mentioned earlier, 144 hertz, right? This is something that people on PCs that play at 144 hertz, they want to watch at 144 hertz, right? And there's no current CDN solution that accommodates 144 hertz. While a traditional broadcast is trying to tackle HDR and trying to tackle this 4K elements, we're sitting here in the esports world going, man, I want to watch this game at 144 hertz. I want to watch this guy play at 144 hertz. Oh, how do I record 144 hertz? Okay, what encoder pushes 144 hertz? And then you start working your way back till you get to the point where you're like, well, a CDN can't handle it, an encoder can't handle it. What replay system can handle that? What switcher can handle that? And you start going, all right, can't do it, And so like those are those innovations where we have to circle with our partners and vendors is to say, hey, crazy idea, 144 hertz. Yeah, I know you're working on this HDR thing. Cool, we don't really care. 144 hertz, like that's our going point right now, right? And so those are those elements that I think strong partner vendorship, like when we start collaborating to get to a goal on saying, hey, esports is important, esports is where things are going, this is what the esports audience wants, how do we make hardware that can accommodate that, and those custom solutions. So, and I could say with custom solutions, VR, HDR, your world.
We everything that we do is 180 or 360 in a combination of some interactive and non-interactive broadcast. So we have our own racks. We've built our own racks that Keycode actually built for us. We've built our own technology, and we've written a lot of our own technology that actually takes VR is new and weird for a lot of people, and the broadcast world is one of the most regimented worlds of production that you'll find anywhere. So I worked in a past lifetime. I was an A1 and A2 on trucks for SEC, so I know that world reasonably well and have the scars to prove it. Being able to build a middleware bridge, being able to build a bridge for how we move from traditional broadcast to VR, and how do we move from HD and 4K broadcast to 180 and 360 broadcast, and add game engines and add other things that are happening in that world, has been something that we've spent a lot of time on. So one thing that I'm proud of, that I'm really proud of, that very few people understand, is that I can take a TD that's never heard of VR before, never put on a headset. I can sit with them for 20 minutes and explain a few things to them, put a headset on them, get their mind right, and then I've done this now a dozen times with TDs. And after about 20 minutes, you can see the light go on. They go, click, got it. Okay, leave me alone. And then they sit down and do their business. Then they sit down and they're good. They're able to apply their existing skill set and their existing talents to a new world, which is something that I think is pretty cool. Yeah. It's akin to, I was around. A lot of you may have been as well. I was around when Avid first started coming out, and all the linear editors were like, "Pah, that stuff will never catch on." And one of the, I think, mistakes that a lot of nonlinear companies made in the early days is they said, "Forget your old toys. These are the new toys, and this is the only way you're going to do it now," without providing a bridge of technology to allow talented people to bring their skills into a new world. And we spend a lot of time doing that, so that existing broadcast professionals, A, we can utilize that talent, and B, so that they're not as threatened when we show up, right? We can show up to somewhere that NEP is wired. We can show up to somewhere that a truck is wired and have a broadcast discussion with those people, have a technical discussion with those people, so that they know that we know what we're talking about, and then we get stuff from them, they get stuff from us, and it helps move the whole world forward. Kumbaya.
Yep.
And the fun thing is you guys have now gone through the crystal ball question, so I don't need to go there. So you were an A2 to begin with, and then you were in the sales side, and you were in traditional broadcast. Yep. How do you learn all this stuff? And, who's going to make the curriculum for everybody to learn this stuff going forward? How do education programs adapt to this?
I was looking at you first.
I'll say that our industry, again, I'll ask a question. How many of you would say you're editors? Okay, not many, that's okay. So, but I'd say that our industry, both broadcast and post-production, is one of the last few true sort of apprentice-based industries, craftsman-based industries out there. You don't go to school to learn to be an EIC. You don't go to school to learn to be a TD. You can go to different programs to learn skills that will certainly help you there. But if you want to be an A1 on a truck, you don't go to school for that. You start out as an A2, you start out wrapping cables, you travel around, and you eventually move up the ranks, right? So the curriculum, I'd say, is, how do you train people for it? And how I got into it is, I always just look for, I've said this a lot of times when I talked before, is that I started off being I came into the world as a musician, and then I was an audio editor and a video editor, and I've done a little bit of everything in the industry. But I'm always motivated by what drives emotion, by what drives response. You're always trying to, if you're communicating, if you're in the communications world, you're always trying to engender a response in an audience, whether you're doing a forklift training video or whether you're editing Game of Thrones. You're trying to engender a response. And for me, I had an aha moment when I put on the first VR headset that I put on like 5 years ago. It was the best way to communicate a message that I had personally ever experienced. And in my brain, if you're not in the industry to try and create as quick and as visceral a response in your audience, then what are you doing? So I decided I wanted to be a VR producer when nobody knew what that meant, and then just sort of drove from there.
Yeah, it's amazing the first time you see a dragon breathing fire on a theatrical screen.
I just made it up as I went along.
Yeah. No, and I would kind of concur with that, is that when we look at the esports world and I mean, the word pioneering is used a lot with esports. And so you look at, hey, we're pioneering technology, we're pioneering broadcast. Well, with pioneering becomes trial and error, right? So we do
The
something.
wild, wild west.
Yes, exactly. So we try something, it doesn't work, we record that, and then we try something different. And we do that a lot. And so when we kind of go into a world with VR, with game feeds, with how we're handling multiple feeds like that, it really becomes hey, what did you do last time? Let me call this guy up. What did you do last time? And kind of go back through and said, you had a problem similar to this. I'm having this weird buzz, or, and you get through those elements, and then you learn, right? And then there's the all-seeing Google that helps you with some things, and collaboration, right? Where you're asking somebody, across the world, hey, have you ever seen this problem? They said, once at my grandma's house, and it was, it works, kind of deal, but it works now. And that's where I think that's the collaboration side, that esports is pushing technology, pioneering through, and we're able to grab those pieces and put it together as engineers, as technical people, and make a great product. Like that's.
And it sounds like there's more of a collaborative thing between folks from different areas. I know sometimes you've got to have the EIC who was on the Oscars to be in New York doing a different show for that show to benefit from what the Oscars learned, 2 years ago.
Exactly.
So it sounds like you guys have a much more community-based, process for this.
Sure.
Well,
Go ahead.
I think also that's because of the nature of esports. Esports and the gamer culture is the culture of the underdog. It's the culture of geeks and nerds and the underdog, and that culture in general, I think, is more sharing and a little more community based than a lot of other cultures.
Yeah. No, you're right, because you win, right? And then you cheer for your friend to win, or you get knocked out and you're cheering. And you see that a lot in the competitive esports side is, once they're eliminated, they're cheering for their next person. They become fans, like they become part of that. And that's something that we don't get to see regularly, right? Is that there's such a community that says, hey, I did this, or hey, I'm gonna create this video tutorial on how to handle this new Fortnite gun, and weapon in there, right? And then everyone's like, oh, that's really cool. Like everyone wants to knowledge share. And I think that's something that doesn't normally happen. And with the community so tight, so technological savvy, like those elements help grow the industry, grow the community, and ultimately make a better product all the way around.
All heroes, no villains.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I mean, exactly.
Which is completely opposite of regular sports.
Sure.
The best analogy I have, again, I do a lot of gaming stuff, but I'm not a gamer myself, so to speak. So the best analogy I have, if you've never been to a big esports event, the best analogy I have for the culture and sort of the community is minor league baseball. At least when I go to a minor league game, I feel like what I think baseball should be. It's about the game, and everybody there's there to have fun. The players it's just a different vibe. And if you're actually motivated enough to go to a minor league game, then you're a real baseball fan. You're not going to Dodger Stadium to go to Dodger Stadium. You're going to see a baseball game. And you're much more motivated by the game and the emotion of the game. The community around esports reminds me of that. Everybody is there for the passion and the love of the game versus so much, it's competition, but it's more a community thing and about the love of the game.
Yeah. And I would even add to some of that, saying, like, if you've ever been to any kind of con, from a Comic-Con, a TwitchCon, any kind of con, some of you guys, your con would be NAB, your con there. Everyone goes to see each other every year and goes through that. Those
Business
yeah,
cards.
exactly. But those elements of camaraderie there, I think, like, that just captures the esports side. It's built on a con.
I mean, if you think about, we're veering way off topic.
Yeah.
But you guys, if you think about cosplay, right? And cosplay gets made a lot of fun of, and people people dress up in all these crazy costumes. What difference is that from putting a block of cheese on your head and going to a Packers game?
Yeah.
It's the same damn thing.
Yeah.
Don't get me started on the Packers. Cool. So we're going to have a little bit of time to open this up for questions from the audience. So if you've got a question, raise your hand. Give me the question. I will repeat it so it goes out on the broadcast, and we will get some answers. Saw a hand over here.
When you're looking or you're scouting for event spaces, you see an event space and you have a stage, lighting in there, PA system, audio. What other things do you look at in the space and think, well, if they have this, this would be the perfect space for me, whether it's a fiber infrastructure or the little data entering the building or cameras already in places. What things do you really
So the question there is, when you're looking for a venue, and you arrive at a venue, there's lighting, there's stage. What other pieces need to be there for that to be a good esports venue? Fiber, infrastructure, IT.
The one of the main ones there, you named a lot of the elements. One of the main ones is internet.
Internet pipe
Yes, the
this
internet.
big.
The more internet you have, the better. The more redundancies of internet that you have, the better, right? Like you're looking at a video game space that needs internet to power, needs internet to run updates, needs internet to stream, needs elements like that. So when we're assessing a venue, that's a key element. I'd also say that the already existing infrastructure is great from a video production side of things. So basing what kind of production you're trying to capture into that space, what kind of video switcher that you have there, right? What kind of cameras do you have there? What it's available? Because what's intriguing as someone that looks at this pretty regularly is saying, oh, they already have this infrastructure, or they already do this. Hey, so we're just going to add our esports side of this and expertise to it. So we're not going to, from audio, from cameras, PTZs. I think like if you have infrastructure in your venue that's already set up, it would be extremely helpful to make that decision, to say, oh, they got us 90% of the way, because I can tell you stories of times where there's been 0 to 10%, and it'd have to bring in all the infrastructure, have to jump all over the hurdles. It's not something you want to accomplish.
If you were tasked to build a curriculum to get a bachelor's degree or even a master's degree to be able to go into this new emerging industry, what are some of the key things that you would want an applicant to be able to have on the resume to be hired in this industry, to be able to jump in and get going? What would it take to get hired and get here? Because I want to know what people should be educated on.
So the question is, if you're designing curriculum toward a college degree, bachelor's, master's, what things do you need to be able to get there, to be able to have on your resume to get into your business?
Yes, you want to go for it?
A willingness to coil cables and work long hours.
$60,000 a year.
I mean, seriously, as far as if I'm looking to hire someone, I'll be honest that for me personally and for what we do, I don't look at education. I see it as oh, that's nice. This person has a double E grad from X college. That's wonderful. They may be more useful in this particular kind of task. But what we do is such an apprentice-based craft, because there's the knowledge of, oh, okay, it's like, in my mind, it's like going to film school. Going to film school teaches you maybe teaches you the mechanics of how to make a film, but it doesn't teach you the social dynamics of a set. It doesn't teach you how to operate on. It doesn't teach you who to piss off and who not to piss off, and when to ask a question and when not to ask a question. Man, the same thing is true on a truck or any kind of broadcast setup. You can learn how to operate a switcher. You can learn how to TD, but you can't learn how to interact in a room that's on fire when several pieces of gear are going down and you got to keep a show on the air and you got to keep your cool. You can only learn that honestly by coming up through the ranks, in my opinion.
So I think that if you're looking at a curriculum that you're trying to get into esports, I think the formal technical training, just like anything, there should be some kind of base level. You're right, Lucas, that there's things that learn on-site and apprentice, but there should be a base level of technical competency. And then after that, there's got to be, like any job, there's got to be some passion there, right? You got to understand what's going on, and you've got to be passionate about what you're doing. When you look at someone that wants to go work on the truck for an NBA and they don't know how to play basketball, it's not going to work out. So you've got to kind of do some research and understand, hey, esports is actually so vast. You've got to understand a lot of different things. You're going to have to understand first-person shooters versus, some more strategic games, card-based games. I'll be honest with you guys. So I don't know how to play Pokemon, like trading card game, and I've logged probably 80 hours in broadcast of watching that, but I just can't consume it. And so I can't be passionate about it, so I can't continue to do broadcasts like that. Like, it's just, there's a knowledge like level, right, that you have to surpass. And so when you get into the esports world and you're saying, hey, we want a curriculum that will set someone up successful to be in esports, you're gonna say, okay, technical skill, cool. We can teach anybody a technical skill, right? Like, I'm going to look at the resume. We're going to say, cool, they graduated from USC. That's great. What games do they know? How do they know how to play? Do you know what emote gets spammed during a chat? Like when you're supposed to reply this. Like, there is so much inside knowledge that happens in esports that the community just knows that gets traded, that you have to be educated in those elements. So sure, the traditional broadcast or traditional education, 100%. I think that there's an argument for that, but the keeping up with any technology, everyone in this room knows technology is changing so fast. What we did a year ago, what we did 5 years ago, what we did 15 years ago, that gear we don't even use. And if you guys are using it, I'm sorry. That's the kind of stuff that I'm like, now let's go up to a year from now, right? 2 years from now, 5 years from now. What gear are we using? What equipment are we using? And what's staying consistent, right? And the thing that's staying consistent that's going to keep this industry growing is going to be passionate people playing video games, right? Passionate people playing video games to continue the growth of esports as it goes and goes and goes, and understanding that in the mainstream. Like, that's the space that I think that a lot of people discredit, that esports doesn't get enough credit on, with people that are in it, understanding all these different games, the rules, the regulations, how to handle all that stuff, the skill sets that are associated to esports. So when you're looking to make a pivot, maybe education-wise, or making a pivot job-wise, like, I say, go to twitch.tv and start watching.
And I agree with everything he said, but also, one thing that I think a lot of people that are not familiar with the world of esports, and I certainly was guilty of this, I'm not anymore, but I certainly was guilty of this, is thinking of it as video games in the traditional sense of how you may have grown up thinking about video games. It's not. It's a sport. It's got its own culture. It's got its own rules. It's got its own language. It's got its own entire ecosystem that lives around each particular game. If you drop somebody from Mars onto Earth, and you said the sentence, well, I've got evil geniuses that just played Barclays on a 5x5 milsim, and you should have seen the last of 2 of 3. They had a 3-on-1. They had a 3-on-1 that was just amazing. And then the next sentence you said was, well, we've got the team just did a fumble on the 5-yard line, and they got to hit the line of scrimmage, and looking like they're going to do a running play up the side. Those are both Greek to somebody who doesn't know that sport and doesn't know that language. Sports and esports are the same thing. They have the same culture. They have the same tribal mentality. It's the same thing, and you've got to approach it as not something that you're just going to be able to learn overnight. It's got its own deep, rich history that goes along with it. And just like any traditional sports fan, or I'm starting to call it IRL sports, because that's just my phrase, because I've been searching for how to distinguish between esports and what people are calling real sports, and I think that's a fallacy. For me, I say esports and IRL sports. That's the best thing I can come up with right now. The same way that a Packers fan is going to know instantly if you're not a Packers fan if you start spouting bullshit. Somebody who's an esports fan, somebody who's a fan of a particular game is going to know instantly if you're not part of that game and you're not part of that culture. So approach it with the seriousness that you would if you decided, hey, I'm going to get into football. It's the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I would also add to some of the elements that when you start thinking like athletes, right? These guys sitting in front of their computer, keyboard, mouse pad, webcam, things that are high intense clicks per second that happen. And these guys, I mean, you guys are technical, like if you look at a color calibrated monitor and you can kind of tell something's off, when you can tell like, hey, that frame rate is just a little different. And these guys are saying, hey, that's not 144 hertz. You know, and they're saying, hey, I've got like a 2 millisecond lag in my mouse right now. And I'm going over here going like, because I'm not a gamer, you know, and I'm looking at going, feels fine to me, Excel, click, ads, you know, like these guys are so precise. They've logged so many hours that the smallest detail varies them, right? And so when you escalate that into a championship series, you escalate that into competitive gaming, and the smallest element, like this is tread on a sneakers kind of deal on the basketball court we're talking about, right? Wrong shoelaces, we're talking, this is that kind of stuff, that's how precise esports is. People can grasp that. Those are the level of excellence that's achieving on there is just incredible.
And the other thing one other thing that I hear a lot, it's just the English language, excuse me, the English language is a funny thing. People get really hung up, and there's a lot of arguments about athletes, about what the word athlete means versus you know, someone that's muscular and a football player versus somebody that's a joystick jockey, right? I actually don't, in my personal opinion, I don't think of professional esports players as athletes. I think for me it makes more sense to think of them as artists, because hey, if you're a professional piano player, all you do is sit at a bench and do this. That's all you do. You're exercising these 10 fingers and you're not moving a muscle other than that. Or if you play violin, you're just doing this all day, right? If you're playing esports, you're doing this all day versus doing this all day. It's kind of the same muscle memory to me. I think of it more as an artist than an athlete, but that's just me.
All right, one more question.
As prize pools continue to grow for all these events, and there's so much more money on the line, how do you think the broadcast production and live event production affect the competitive integrity of players?
So as the prize pools go up, how do you feel the broadcast integrity?
How do you feel broadcast and live event production play into the competitive integrity part of it?
How do broadcast and live production play into the competitive integrity?
Yeah.
So, all you.
Yeah. So no, it's actually really valid, and something that we're tackling regularly now is, you know, you want to do better broadcasts, you want to do more technology, you want to do things, and there's a lot of money on the line, right? You know, with millions and millions of dollars, and you know, tampering, things like that, it's real, right? So when you start looking at a better example, probably like World Series of Poker, you know, prize, like those kind of elements on, you know, streaming on your phone, what you can see, what you can't see while people are playing. I mean, these are elements that will continue to be brought up, and probably for each game get addressed individually based on the prize pool. I mean, we have teams and systems and mechanisms in place to account for any kind of tampering, any kind of adjustments in there, and any broadcast innovation that we do for a show goes through the league operations teams.
Process.
Yeah, that go through and say, well, hold on, that gives this person an unfair advantage. Hey, it's really cool you guys want to do some replays and stuff, but that's going to give people, you know, strategy-based content that could affect the game, right? And so those type of elements, and then you say, okay, well, hold on, the NFL has a little iPad on the sideline or Surface that they review every play, you know? So what really is the line of giving someone information ahead of time, giving someone a competitive advantage, versus just giving people knowledge that they can then review and process themselves, right? So
I mean, it's kind of similar to, you know, now you see coaches on the sidelines and players on the mound on a discussion covering their faces.
Yep.
Because television is able to resolve and people are able to read lips.
Yeah.
That didn't used to be the case.
Yeah.
You know, you'd have a wide shot from third base.
yeah,
You know, it's a much different thing.
absolutely.
There was another question over here.
Yeah, follow up on the earlier question on the education. Now, I assume many of us here are in traditional broadcasting and are also somewhat interested or even passionate about video games. So my question to you guys, how are those of us who have basic knowledge already can then move from our more traditional broadcasting into the esports sphere and find opportunities there? What would be the best course of action to find that kind of opportunity?
So follow-up question on the one before on education. If you're currently in the broadcast industry, how do you get to the esports broadcast industry?
Yeah, call them here. Take my business card. I'll get you going. No, I think that's kind of the first step. Just like you probably did with the traditional broadcast, right? Everyone wants experience, and you have to have a job to get experience. And so you had to hustle. You had to get some friends. You had to kind of go through. I would probably say the same thing in this world is getting connected to an esports. There are tons of LANs that happen out there where you're just getting plugged into the community. There's tons of opportunities just to stream yourself, to get familiar with elements, and then you'll be surprised. There's a lot of traditional broadcasts that get connected to esports right now. So I am, if you do want to talk afterwards,
I would also say, because that's exactly what I did. I was not in the esports world. I was doing VR broadcast, but I guess more traditional broadcast. And I wanted to get into the esports world. I just did a ton of research. I just night after night and weekend after weekend, I researched, because I'm not a gamer myself. I researched the games. I researched the competitions, who did what, and sort of I immersed myself in the world and learned about it. And if you immerse yourself in any world, you're going to start making the connections and meeting the people, and the opportunities are more likely the more you immerse yourself in that world, in my opinion.
And there's still going to be cable pulling through snow.
Yeah,
That's not going to
that
change.
doesn't go away.
Minneapolis
Yeah.
in January. It's never fun. Anybody else with questions? There we go.
These venues, how much broadcast production, like cameras, tripods, pedestals, like I see a lot of PTZ being used. Do you see much of that broadcast level cameras and like long lenses, broadcast quality cameras, that type of thing?
So that question is, in these venues, are you seeing broadcast style long lenses, tripods, or is it mainly PTC?
Yeah. So it really depends on the show and the venue, most of the stuff, right? So we've done shows where we need long lens, right? We need 70 and 90 buys. And then we run steady cams with 14 buys that are on the front, right? Most of the level of, if you're in a venue and you're you're putting out the money to get in a big space like that, you're going to want your broadcast to look clear and clean, right? So you see a lot of broadcast cameras, a lot of high-end broadcast cameras. We're not going short on that by any means, but it's more about making that show work. And I'll say a note if there are particular elements where you need to be on stage, but to his point earlier about competitive integrity and stuff, being on stage might actually cause problems, right? Things that you don't think about in traditional stuff is, hey, by a person being on stage, it might actually shake the stage. And with a keyboard and mouse that's on the stage, if you're right behind somebody and you walk up on them, they can actually feel you walk up on them because the stage is shaking, right? When you start thinking by those 4x8, flats and stuff. So those things actually come into a camera plan for us when we say, well, maybe we should probably use a jib, right? Maybe we should probably use something that's more of a wire cam, or a steady cam will work just here. Those angles on the players, again, to tournament integrity, a lot of times things are used if there are competitors beside each other, there's some kind of blocking, right? So you get to see a lot of cameras that are right above the player, and that's honestly to get some kind of shot on them, right, the player, because other than that, how am I supposed to film somebody if they've got a box around their head, But we need that box around their head because for tournament integrity's sake, we can't let them see the screen beside the player beside them. And so I think case by case, we use long lenses, we use broadcast cameras, a full spectrum of cameras from $500 to $100,000.
One thing that you'll certainly see is the same kind of stage build out, same kind of iMags and same kind of big screens and same kind of production there.
Yeah.
That's the same.
Back there?
How much more you guys, or less, or how much are you guys using things like NDI or video writing, audio writing, Dante, things like that versus traditional SDI, wiring?
So the question is, how much of the IP-based infrastructure, NDI, Dante, is being used as opposed to traditional SDI infrastructure these days?
So really depends on the function of what I need, right? Yes, use all of the above is the short answer, but really becomes just like an engineer, right? What tool do we need to make something work? And if that's price point driven, if that's an efficiency driven, if that's just a function driven, I've been in scenarios where the only way to get to something is network. You know, like you can't run a cable there, right? But we want this shot or we want this source. And so I would say, you know, yes to new technology. It's easier to try new technology in an esports environment. When we work with broadcast trucks or flight kits or things that are not ours that we own, we might have to be forced to go down a more traditional path. Patch bays and copper become something where now we're looking at DAs all across the building, right? And how does that structure work? Specifically in venues when you start looking at like, oh man, we've got all this patch, but it's all for triacs. And you're like, well, that's not gonna help me for anything, right? And you say, well, let's look at what kind of SMPTE patches do you have? What kind of fiber patches do you have? And then how can we break that out and make that work? And to your point about being kind of an artist, I would argue that a lot of the engineering that we do is pretty artistic when we come in there and say, okay, what tools do we have? Now we've got to figure out how to make it work, you know?
It's, and at least for what we do, we're also adding the additional factor of, if any of you have ever seen VR video, it's this weird warped geometry. So we're also adding software in the mix and some of our own tools in the mix that are able to take any kind of geometry. Rectilinear is the name of the geometry that everybody's used to, right? But we can convert rectilinear to what's called half equirectangular or full equirectangular and monoscopic and stereoscopic, and we can do all that in real time. So we're dealing with traditional broadcast stuff, but we're also dealing with mixing and matching geometries, and then also doing things like, okay, we have 360, and we have a bunch of feeds coming in from that are rectilinear feeds. How do we build scenes in which we're converting those in real time with no lag, and then also being able to put them as virtual IMAGs in the scene, and how do we build creatively with those other sources coming in?
Software glue and hardware glue. That's what we're talking about. All right, gentlemen, ladies.
One other quick thing. Esports, though, is you're talking about technology and adopting new technology. Esports is a fantastic place for that because baseball's not changing. The game is not changing significantly. Football is not changing significantly. The ways to do those broadcasts are pretty set in stone because they work, right? They look great and they work and they deliver what audiences want to see. Esports, it's a new game. It's a new game every day, and that game will change significantly in the next 3 months. In the next year, it's probably going to be a completely different game.
Yeah.
Awesome. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. My apologies to Matt Damon. We're out of time. So what we'd like you to do is, stay around for a bit, have a chat with our vendors. We've got Ross, and we've got Sony, we've got Clearcom, Scale Logic. So talk with them about different solutions for what ails you. And thank you again, gentlemen, for coming on down and enlightening us. And me.
Thank you.
Thank you.